Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of episode 1 of CG Unscripted. In this episode, in this first episode, we're going to be looking at building this logo construction in Cinema 4D, where we're looking at different modeling techniques, and then texturing and lighting it with Redshift, and then rendering it. So, in the first part, we spoke about a lot of different mid-level sort of Cinema 4D modeling techniques, such as insetting and extruding polygons, creating, using the bevel deformer, we had a little conversation about local offsets versus global offsets, and when you make an object the child of another object, it uses its parents' coordinates as its local coordinates, no matter where the parent is. So we spoke about that. We spoke about using MoGraph and the spline effector to affix those little cones around the edge of the pipe that goes around the construction. We talked about beveling text and creating splines and extruding splines and all those things like that. So we had a discussion on how to build the logo construction that we are now going to, in part 2, light it, texture it in Redshift. So with part 1 out of the way, or part 1 done, we're now going to focus this second part on texturing in Redshift. So if you haven't watched part 1, I suggest that you do it. But if you're only interested in Redshift and how to texture with Redshift, you can just watch this part 2. It's up to you if you want to take a look at part 1. Now I've created some files to go along with this episode. I mentioned it in the first part, and I'll mention it here again in part 2. So if you go over to Gumroad, you will be able to find the files that to download them that you can follow along with. Now you don't have to follow along, you can just watch it if you want to. But I would suggest that you download them and follow along, because you will get a lot more practice and you'll probably learn it a lot better. Here is the link. I'll also put it in the description. It's totally free to download it. It doesn't cost anything. However, if you want, you could just enter a 0 here and just download it for free. If you want to add a few bucks or whatever you feel like adding to help out the stream and help out the show, I would appreciate it. There's a lot of things I'd like to do and show you guys and work on stuff together. So that would be much appreciated if you could leave a little donation. But you don't have to. If you just want to get the files, you just can enter a 0 here. It's up to you. So having said that, if you download it, what you will get is you will get basically a lighting folder, which contains the HDR image-based lighting file that we're going to use to light the scene, as well as a textures folder, which is going to have all the textures that are being used inside of the scene. And then you will have the standard materials C4D file, which is an already textured version that you could look at for reference, as well as an untextured version of it that we're going to be using in this part to texture the files. Now, in the standard material CG Unscripted standard materials file, if you double click that, it will open itself up in Cinema 4D. And what happens is that if you, right now it's missing all the textures. And if this happens to you, Actually, it might not. It might just link to the textures. But if it doesn't link to the textures, okay, and you see like a lot of black textures or textures that don't make sense, what you can do is you can go into the window menu and you can choose the Project Asset Inspector. Now, if you choose that, this will tell you all the assets in the project. And as you can see, there's a red X next to all of them, which means that all of these files are not found in the file. So in order to relink them, you can shift-click the first one. Click the first one and shift-click the last one so they're all selected. And go into the Asset menu and choose Relink Assets. And then find the folder, which is this folder here, that has all of these textures in it and the lighting. So it's the CGU Show 1 folder. Select it, and then it's going to relink all the textures, and everything will be fine. And as you can see, if I were to bring up my Redshift render view, and let's say I were to dock it right here, and I were to hit play, it will render it no problem. There's no missing textures in it at all. So that's actually kind of a useful tip to know in case you are missing your textures. You can relink it. I am running off of a laptop, by the way, because I happen to be somewhere. I'm not around my desktop, but it should run fine. Everything's going to run pretty well. But it might even run better if you're running like a hefty GPU at home or wherever you are at work or whatever. Okay, now, so let's actually open up the untextured file, because we want to texture it ourselves. So I'm just going to open it, and there you can see there's the same file with absolutely no textures at all, and no lighting either. There's no lighting and there's no texture. The light that's being generated in this scene is the default light, which is kind of like if you've got a flashlight on your head. It's always lighting it like from the camera view, you know, so it's an ugly light, and that's where the lighting is coming from. Okay. So now if I wanted to light this, oh, by the way, make sure, actually you don't have to do this already because you have I've already done it in the file, but if you're starting a new project or you're using Redshift, make sure you go to the render settings first and change the renderer to Redshift away from any of these other renderers, because that otherwise you will have a problem rendering it out with Redshift. So now to create the lighting for this, and get rid of this ugly lighting, let me hide this camera also for a second. Okay. To get rid of that ugly lighting, what we're going to do is I can create lights, actually, if I want to. I can go into the Redshift menu and go to where it says lights, and then go to, you know, I can make, like, for example, like an area light, okay, and drag that out to here. You know, it's like really bright, this light right now, so I can click on the area light and like lower the intensity, let's say to 25 or something, and you know, drag this out to here and move this light up. It's hard to see it, but there it is. Okay, move this light up to here and rotate it, and I can create, you know, a lighting setup to with this. You know, I can put in a few lights. I can color some of the lights. I can put in a fill light and a key light and a fill light and a rim light and all that stuff, and create a nice little lighting setup for my image. Okay, but I'm not going to do that, actually. But although that's completely a good way to do it, maybe we can talk about lighting in future episodes of CG Unscripted. But I'm going to kill that light. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in an HDR. So what is an HDR? You might already know what an HDR is, but in case you don't know what an HDR is, it's also called image-based lighting. It's a high dynamic range image that somebody has gone into an interior scene, like it could be a factory or a garage, or it could be, you know, a beautiful building or a temple or something like that, or it could be outdoors in the middle of a field or on a sandy beach or whatever, and they capture a 360-degree image that's spherical of the entire scene. And since it's high dynamic range, they can use that to light the scene and recreate a very naturalistic lighting look with the right color shadows and whatever. So that's what we're going to use here. We're actually going to use an HDR image. Okay. If you want to see what the HDR image looks like in Photoshop, we can actually open it up. By the way, this is what we're going to look at. What is that we're going to be creating? We're going to be creating all of these textures and this lighting in this part 2. So if I go to this CG Unscripted stuff that you will be able to download from Gumroad, and you open it up, you can see that that's what it is. That's what the HDR looks like. It's sort of an interior view of a kind of little studio there. Okay, and we're going to use that to light the scene. There's like a window in the front, and there are these lights on the top. So, and you can see that it's a spherical. It's meant to be wrapped around a sphere. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into our scene, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to we're going to go to the Redshift menu, and we're going to go over to lights, and we're going to choose what's called a dome light, okay? Now, what a dome light is that, first of all, if I were to move out, it's actually like a huge white light sphere around the entire scene, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to take this dome light, and instead of a white sphere, we're going to map that HDR image on this infinitely large sphere. So we're going to go to the lighting folder, and we're going to click on this HDR. We can click no here, okay, and then it pops it into this sphere. So if I were to hide everything, or let me just zoom out, okay, you can see that this image here is now being lit by that HDR. Now, I actually kind of like it right there where it came in, but if you want, you can actually take this dome light and you could rotate it around any axis, and it will change the lighting based on where it is. So here the light's coming from the back, or you can have the light coming from sort of the side. That kind of looks interesting. Or you can have it come around on this side, or sort of, but we're going to just sort of leave it back the way it came in. I thought that was fine, and I'm happy with that kind of lighting. Now, a lot of times when you're working, that thing can kind of get in the way, this sphere around everything. So if you click on the dome light under Object, by the way, here is where you choose the HDR under Texture. Okay, you click on this little button here that looks like a little folder, and then that's where you can pull in the HDR. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck where it says background here. Okay, and now you don't see it, but it's still having its effect. It's still lighting the scene. You just don't happen to see it. So there we have it. We've got the HDR lighting the scene, which gives it a nice natural look with the shadows not too dark and not too filled in. And now we're ready to start building some textures. Okay, now for the first texture, we're going, to get to the textures in Cinema 4D, you press this little button right here under the Material Manager. In the old days, if you remember, the Material Manager was down here. Or if you're still using some version of Cinema 4D prior to R25 or whatever, you would have your materials down here. But now they are actually over here in this area. And there's no materials left yet here that we are going to, that are there yet. So let's start making some materials. Now, by the way, this is a slightly different version than the one that we made in part 1, but it's basically the same thing. I've added some nulls and stuff in here to organize the model a little bit better. But in general, you know, here's the cloner and here's the torus. Everything is there as the same as in part 1. So now the first thing we're going to texture is this little plane here. Okay, this little plane here that, as you can see there, that we created, that we pushed inside of the box, the frame of the box a little bit. And we're going to stick our first material on that. And the material that we're going to be using, if I open it up in Photoshop, okay, as you can see here under textures, okay, you can see it's going to look something like this. It's like sort of a wood type of a texture with the word unscripted painted on top of the wood. You can see there's like a little texture inside of the word. And then it says with Joe Herman, and there's an arrow on there. So we're going to stick that right on that plane. Okay, so now in version 3.5 of Redshift, there's a new kind of material. Previously, if you wanted to create a material, you would create just like a material over here, and it would call a Redshift material. And that was the common way to do it just until recently, until this new version of Redshift came out. But now there's a new kind of material here. It's actually called the standard material. And going forward, it's going to become the new standard. It's actually sort of like an Uber material. It's got everything that the regular material had or has, as well as a lot of more really cool stuff in it. So, you know, I've heard that this standard material is going to be the way of the future and the way Redshift is going to keep going on. So we're going to use this standard material. If you're used to using the regular Redshift material, you could still do it, but I suggest that you switch over to this new standard material. So we're going to create it. Now it says Redshift Standard instead of Redshift Material. So I'm going to double click it, and I'm just going to call it Unscripted. And now I'm going to double click the material, and it brings up the node editor. Now this node editor is sort of new too in 3.5. It looks different than the previous Redshift node editor, but it's more or less doing a similar thing, and it's more in line with, you know, Cinema 4D nodes and, you know, the new direction that Cinema 4D is going. But generally, if you know the old node editor, you'll pick up the new node editor. And if you don't know the old node editor, well, you can just start learning this new one. So the first thing that I'm going to do is that you see that here's the Redshift standard node, and then it's going to the output of the material. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to create a new texture node. So we're going to go to this little plus icon here, and we're going to type in texture. And there's the texture node. I'll double click that, and that gives me a texture node. So if I click on that node and I click on this little down here, because whenever you click on a node, its attributes pop up in the attribute manager. So we're going to click on this node, and we're going to click on this little folder icon, and we're going to pull in from the textures folder, we're going to pull in that texture that we looked at in Photoshop, and we're going to click open. And we'll click no here because it wants to make a copy of the texture, and we don't want to do that. So we're just going to click no. And there it is. And now what we're going to do is we're going to drag it on top of, we're going to drag it into the color input of the RS standard material. Okay? And there we have it. And we're still not finished setting up this texture, but I already want to put it onto the material because I want to show you a few things. So actually I'm going to close this node window and I'm going to drag this material onto the unscripted box. Oh no, not the unscripted box. I'm going to drag this material onto the plane, the unscripted plane, which is right here. It just says unscripted and it has a little icon of the little plane. That's where I'm going to drag it. So you'll notice here that this texture is being squished into that little box. Okay? And the reason that it's being squished is that if we click on the texture tag right here on the plane, texture tag, we can see that it's being UVW mapped onto, it's being mapped onto its UVs. And originally this plane was square. But when we squished it down, it became distorted. Now we could remap the UVs, or we can go into a UV mapping thing here in order to fix the UV mapping so that doesn't happen. But that we would have to have a discussion about UVs, and I didn't really want to get into UVs into this lesson, but that is something that maybe we can get into in a future future episode of CG Unscripted. But for right now, we're going to do it a different way. And that is we're going to change the projection from UVW mapping to flat. Now, when we bring it into flat, something else happens. Now it seems like too elongated. And what's happening really is if we go on here, on one of these tools up here, onto the texture tool, like that, you can actually see how this image is being mapped. And it's being mapped as a square onto the flat mapping way. On the flat mapping method, it's being mapped as a square. And if you look at our texture map, it's not square. It's kind of rectangular. So what I'm going to do is, you could do things like, for example, what you can do with this texture tool is you can actually scale this texture bigger or smaller. Okay, even, however much you want to scale it like that. Or you could actually move it. Okay, you can move the texture around on the thing. Or you could actually rotate the texture. So if you want to have the texture rotated like that. And that's all done with this little texture tool right here on the tool, on the top toolbar. So, but what we want to do though, in order to get the exact right dimensions for this, is that since this is a square, we want to shrink it on its Y dimension. And you might ask yourself, well, how much am I supposed to shrink it here? What am I just supposed to eyeball it? Okay. And the thing is that you could eyeball it if you want to, if you're not really concerned about it that much. But if you want to get it exactly the same way that it was in the texture, you could just do a little simple formula. And what it is that you can find out what the ratio of the height to the width is. Okay, so let's take a look, for example, at the image size, and let's take a look at the pixels here, and we can see that it's 2K wide, 2048 by 1164 high. So what we can do is we can bring up our calculator, and we could just say 1164 divided by 2048 equals about 0.57, or you could think of it as that the height is 57% of the width. Okay, this is 57% of the width. So what you can do now is just go back to Cinema 4D, and you could go to the texture tab, and where it says length U and V, for the length of the V, you could just type in a 57 like that. Let me move this down now into the right place because it's not in the right place. And now this is correct as far as the, it's exactly the right ratio from height to width. Okay. So, however, it's still too small. So now I can use the scale tool and just scale it, not on any one axis, but scale it up on all three axes like that. And I can get it to be the right position that I want it to be. If I want, I can turn this around a little bit. I can move it a little bit if I want to. And I can get it exactly in the place that I wanted to get it in. And that's all done here with this texture tool, which is a really good tool to have, and it can really, you know, make things a lot easier to get exactly how you want it to be. Okay, so let's say that's fine. Okay, if you want, you make it a tiny bit bigger. And there you have it. Okay, so now that's fine. The thing is that there's other things, there are other components to this material besides just a color map. Okay, so let's see. Let's go ahead and let's create another texture node here. And let's go ahead to this little folder icon. And let's go to under textures, and we'll find that it actually has what's called a normal map. So let's bring that in. And plus no over there. Now, what is a normal map? Well, there's actually, it's kind of a bump map. And now if you're asking me what a bump map is, then I'll tell you what that is. So what a bump map and a normal map is it's a texture map that perturbs the normals on a surface to make it look bumpy. Now, what is a normal of a surface? Well, for example, if this is a surface, a normal is usually 90 degrees perpendicular to that surface. And from the position of the normal, you can calculate the lighting. Okay? Now, if you have a surface that's very smooth with not a lot of geometry on it, you know, every polygon has its own normal. Okay? Now, if you want to make that look bumpy, you have two choices. Either put a lot more polygons on it in order to get a lot of geometry in different, you know, with different normals on it, which would make you a very heavy model because it would have so much geometry in it. Or you could use a bump map or a normal map. And what it is that in the case of a bump map, it uses a grayscale map to create the bumps on the surface. Different shades of gray changes the normals. And in the case of a normal map, it's like even more information, okay? Because I will show you, like, for example, here's a bump map. And as you can see, it just uses, like, this is for a wood. You can see that it just uses grayscales. So wherever there's going to be a darker gray, it's going to be like an indentation into the surface, okay? But in the case of a normal map, there's a lot more information. Okay, so we'll bring in this normal map for this thing. And you can see here that that it not only uses, it doesn't use grayscale, but it uses like RGB values, which also gives the renderer angle information for the way that the normals are. So both are good, but a normal map can contain more detail and is more powerful than just a grayscale bump map. But they're both useful, but the normal map has more information in it. Now later we're actually going to talk about something called a displacement map. Okay, because if you use a bump map or a normal map, although the surface might look bumpy, if you were to look at it from the side, very close up, it would still look very smooth. That at least the profile would look smooth, but the surface would look bumpy. In a displacement map, it actually creates more geometry. And then if you were to look at something on the side, then you actually would see that it has like pits and craters in it physically. So if you're going to be using, like, if you're going to be doing like, you know, like a mountainside or a cliffside or something like that, you probably want to use displacement maps. But if you're going to be doing like the surface of an orange, probably you'd be using bump or normal maps, because you're never going to get so close to the orange that you're going to notice that, you know, that it's not, you know, pitted like that, you know. So it depends what you're doing, what you want to use. Bump maps are used very, very often in computer graphics. And displacement maps are also used, especially on like rocky surfaces and things like that. So what we want to do is we want to use this normal map to make the surface of that wood look bumpy. Because right now, if we were to look at this surface of this wood, you can see that it looks very, very smooth. And it's shiny too, because there's a high degree of reflectivity on it. Okay, so it looks almost like, you know, shiny plastic or something. Not very, you know, useful for us for what we want to do. So what we're going to do is that we can't just take the out color and put it into the bump map. That's not going to work. Okay, what we have to do is we have to first create what's called a bump node. So we're going to click on this plus button. We're going to choose bump like that. And we are going to pipe the out color from the normal map into the input of the bump node. Okay, make sure, by the way, when you create a bump node, you don't choose the bump blender. That's a very common mistake. You want the bump map. The bump blender lets you blend multiple normal and bump maps to create like composite bumpy surfaces. Okay, but we want just a bump map. Now, so we put this bump map into the bump, we put this normal map into the bump map node. And the first thing we have to do is we have to tell this bump map node that we want it not to be a height field. Now, a height field is just a grayscale bump map. But this is actually a real normal map. So we want to tell it that we wanted to have it a tangent space normal. Okay? So that's the kind of normal map that we want. Now it knows that it's a normal map and not a bump map. Now, the problem is that if we were now to go ahead and pipe this into the bump node, okay, it's not really working. Something's wrong. I mean, it kind of works. You see some bumping here. But the thing is that a lot of times, if you're not getting a result you're expecting, what you can do is normal maps are made differently by different programs. Okay, so sometimes what you have to do is you have to go over here and you have to say flip normal Y. If your normal maps are not, if you're not getting the result you're expecting to get, flip the normal Y like that. Now, as soon as I flip the normal Y, you can see that this is behaving much more because I needed to flip that normal Y. And you can see that it's no longer like a really smooth surface, okay? But you actually have a bump on the surface. It's bumpy, okay? Now, if that's too bumpy for you, you can lower it. So like let's lower this to 0.66. Okay, so it's not quite as bumpy. Okay, it was more bumpy the other way, this way. Okay, or we'll lower it. Let's say if we lowered it to 2.25, then it's very, very light. Okay, so let's do 0.5. Okay, so there we have it. We're like really close to it, so it's exaggerated, but it's a little bit bumpy. You can see it here, like that, and that's our normal map. Now, the other thing is that right now this is like really shiny. Okay, so what we want to do is you can do two things. You could either affect the shininess globally in the standard material under reflection with this roughness slider. So the lower it is, the more glassy it will look. Here it looks like, you could really see the reflection of the HDRI in there. For example, if I were to mute this wire right here, it's almost like a mirror surface without the normal map. Okay, it's almost like a mirror surface. Now, if I were to up the roughness now, you'll notice that it starts getting more and more matte. And the more I go up, the less reflective it becomes, until when it's all the way up, it's like not reflective at all. Okay, it's just completely matte. Okay, so that's how you can do it globally. Let me put the bump back on. Okay, so that's how you would do it globally. But you can also do it with a map, okay? And a grayscale map where the dark parts of the map mean very reflective and the light parts of the map mean very matte, okay? So let's actually go ahead and we press the plus button and we're going to choose a texture node. And what we're going to do is we are going to bring into the texture here, right here, under textures. We're going to bring a reflection map, and now most of it is really, really dark, as you can see. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at that map in Photoshop. And you can see that it's really, really dark. So it's going to be really, really reflective until it hits these lighter areas where it's going to be less reflective. I think that's how it works. So let's go ahead into the roughness channel. And there you can see it's actually really reflective, and I don't want that. Okay? But at the same hand, I don't want it to be, I want it to have some difference in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pipe this out of this texture and onto the surface, just right onto the surface with no lighting or anything. Okay, I just want to take a look at what this looks like on the surface, and it's not even being affected by lights. Going straight out from the texture onto the surface. This is a very handy technique, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in what's called a ramp. Now, when you want to control a texture, you could remap its grayscale, its values through what's called a ramp. And you could get you could tell it not to go totally, like for example, actually rather than talk about it, I'm gonna input this into. Now, when you input it, actually this in Redshift 3.5, things are a little bit different, and also I'm actually kind of used to using Octane a lot. So the ramps have different inputs there. But the only input that worked the way that I thought it should work is this Alt input. right here. So I'd put it in the alt input like that. And from the alt input, I'll put that into the surface. Oops. In the alt input, I'll put that into the surface. Right now, that's not changing anything, right? But what I can do now is I can take the white slider and like really compress the gradation from dark to light. And you can see that I've created, you know, I'm creating a different mapping of the light and dark values through this ramp. So it's creating, it's compressing the time that it takes to get to the light. So let's say, for example, I want to create a lot less, like let's say, for example, like this. Oops. And create other nodes on this. Okay, like a little bit like that. Right? And like if I double click this, I can tell it I don't ever want it to get pure white, which means non-reflective at all. I want it maybe to maintain a little reflectivity in the lights. And I never wanted to get it purely reflective in the blacks either, so I can bring that up a little bit. Maybe something like this. So you can see it looks different. You could also change the midpoint with this. So let's see what this looks like if we use this into the reflection, roughness, and then we output this into back out to the surface of the object. It's better, but it's still too reflective, so I'm going to up this reflection to like 10%. And or maybe even 20%. And maybe bring this in like that, and maybe bring this back a little lighter. Anyway, this is one example of how to do that. And remember, never go by here, but it's just sort of a little bit reflective, a little bit bumpy. And, you know, it's just, you know, I mean, you don't really can't notice it all that much here, but believe me, a lot of times you do notice it in your materials. And it makes a difference between something that really looks good. It depends on how the reflections are, what the different kind of maps you use, and so on and so forth. So anyway, this one is done. So we've got that set up. Okay, we've got the reflection map. I mean, we've got the unscripted set up. So now let's move on to this this sort of background here. Okay, so we're going to make a new material again. Okay, so we're going to go ahead. I'm going to say new standard material. Remember, we're doing all standard. We're going to make this like copper. Right, so it's going to be this copper disc. Okay, so we're going to double click on that once again to get back into the nodes. We're going to go over here and we're going to say texture. I'm going to bring a new texture node. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and we are going to choose that texture. No. And we're going to pipe that into the color. And we are going to, once again, drag that onto the CG disk, which is that. Okay, so it comes in there. Now it's actually mapping fine because we didn't squish the disk, you know, around much. So it's just mapping. It's mapping onto the UVs, but they're not distorted, so it looks fine. So we don't have to go to a flat mapping mode unless you wanted to. You could also map this flat if you want to. If you wanted to also rotate it or or scale it or whatever. You can map it flat. So, but we're going to leave that on there. And on UV mapping, you can see right here if I click on the texture tag, we're not on flat. We're UV mapping it. And we can talk about UV mapping at some other point. But that's fine. Let's actually go ahead and make a new texture node. And let's see what else this material has. It has a normal map, okay, like the other one did. Okay, and here's what it looks like. So you can more or less see what the surface is by looking at the map. It's kind of like a pitted, you know, or distressed surface. So we're going to take that. Once again, if you want to use a normal map, you need to make a bump node. So we need to make a bump node. Okay. Pipe that in to the input. Okay. Pipe that into the bump. You need to tell the bump map that this is not a height field. So click on the bump map. Go over here where it says input map type. This is not a height field. It's not a grayscale bump map. It is a normal map. Okay. And let's take a look at what's going on here. Okay. You see here something looks weird. And once again, that is because this bump map was created in this normal map was created in a program, and we need to flip its Y normal like that. We need to flip its Y normal, and now we can see that this is indeed working correctly, and you can see its bumpiness. Okay. If I were to disable it, then it would just be flat. But enabled, it has a little bit of a bumpy texture to it. Let me make sure I'm still, yeah, I'm at 100% on this window. Now it's too shiny, so actually this thing here, if you want, you could actually take a texture and just copy and paste it. And this way you don't have to always create a new node. And what we're going to do is we are going to choose, oops, a reflection map. No. And here's what the map looks like. And we'll drag it into the roughness. Okay. And it's still kind of like really shiny. So if you want, you can, you can, for example, if you want it less shiny, because that's very shiny. Okay, if you want it less shiny, once again, you can simply, add a ramp. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to add a little ramp. Pipe it into its input, alt input, pipe it out to its roughness. And then I'm simply going to raise the darkness up a little bit. If I just double click the darkness and raise it up a little bit like that. Well, that's too much. Like that. Maybe a little bit more. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to create this sort of an iron, a wrought iron look for this outer tube here. And this is going to be a metallic material. Okay? So we're going to create this to be a metallic look. So what we're going to do, if you want to see what it looks like, actually, we're going to take a look at the reference. And there it is. And you can see that how this kind of looks like an iron type of material here. See that? So what we want to do is we want to create a wrought iron rough metallic look here. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first thing we need to do is create a new, you guessed it, standard material. And we're going to call this iron. And double click it, and here's sort of like where it where you can see that it looks sort of this gray, and right now it looks like plastic. Okay, so to get something looking from plastic to metal, it would be nice if there's like was just like a little metallic button that you could press, and then it makes it metallic. And guess what? There is one. Actually, and it's kind of new in 3.5. Okay, all I have to do is take the metalness slider and slide it all the way up to 1, and now it's metal. But it doesn't really look like iron. It looks like kind of like a chrome type of a look. If you wanted a real chrome, you could make this sort of like white up here. Okay, and now it looks like really chrome or aluminum or something like that. But we want to actually drag it down because we're going to be kind of a darkish iron. Now, the thing is, though, its surface is too mirrored. Okay? So what we want to do is, we talked about the roughness sliders before, and we talked about roughness maps. And you could also use roughness maps for this if you wanted a scratchy iron or not, or an iron that's like irregular and has like scratches and scuffs in it. You could use like a roughness map, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to use a roughness map. We're just going to give it an all-over sort of rough look. So we're going to drag this slider up to about halfway, okay, and it's going to give you kind of like we'll drag it right to about 4.45, something like that, and it's going to give us a rough metal look, okay, like a buffed metal. And let's just say we want to make it a little bit darker, like that, because we want it to have it like a dark iron. And we're going to take this. That's all you really need to do. And then we're going to take this, oops, and we're going to take this and we're going to drag it onto the torus. And it already looks pretty good. It already looks like metal. And we'll zoom in a little bit onto it. If you want, you can make it a little bit darker. But we'll leave it for now. But however, what I want to do is I don't want to have it so smooth like that, because it is so smooth right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a bump map. Okay, not a normal map, but a grayscale bump map to perturb the normals on its surface to give it kind of like a bumpy look. And to do that, I'm going to use something called a Maxon noise. Maxon noise texture. Now, this Maxon noise texture, if I were just to type it right inside of the surface, right onto the surface, you can see that it's just simply a noise. But I don't want that noise. I don't want this particular noise, which is actually just called noise when you click on the node. I want a noise called displaced Voronoi, okay, which looks something like that. So what I want to do now is, now that we know what that looks like, okay, now what I want to do is I want to use it to control the bump map. So you can make bump maps not only from maps, like we already used a bump map or a normal map. You could use it using this Maxon noise thing. And it's actually, there's a lot of different kinds of noises in Maxon noise. So you can find a noise that you like for different things. Different noises come with different things. So what I'm going to do, this one happens to be nice to create kind of like a bumpy metal. So we're going to take this. We can't just plug it into the bump. We still have to make, we have to go to the nodes. We still have to make a bump node. Okay. And we have to drag this in to their input, and then drag that onto the bump. And then as soon as we do that already, now wait a second, something looks wrong. Oh, because I just made that mistake that I told you not to make before. I chose bump blender. Okay, so be careful that when you're creating a noise, okay, when you're creating a noise node, I mean a bump node, see bump, make sure you don't choose the bump blender, you choose the bump map. There we go. Now, I'm going to click in there, click here into the input, okay. And then we're going to click in the output into the bump map. And then already you can see that there's a nice sort of noise going on into the metal. Now, that's all well and good. If I want to, I can scale this noise up and down. Okay, for example, I can scale this noise up and down over here under overall scale in the noise node. So if I wanted to make it twice as big, I can make it twice as big like that. Or if I want to make it half as big, I can make it half as big as what came in. Okay, and now it looks like really, really bumpy. Okay, and let's say we leave it like that, but let's say, for example, in the bump map, which is, by the way, a height field, you leave it as height field. Let's just say we make it 0.25. Okay. Oops. You can see it like that. So that's good. You know, if you want, you could even lower it if you wanted it to be more of a subtle bump, just like something that's not so perfect like that. You could do it like that. Also, if you want, let's darken a little bit this color here. So it's not quite, it's a little bit darker, a little bit of a darker metal. And now what I want to do is I want to take this iron, and I also want to put it on these little spikes coming out. So we're going to go ahead to where the cloner is. We're going to find the cone, and we're going to drag that right onto the spike. Okay. So now what's happening is that we've got this nice metal look, you know, to the thing. So we can tweak it later if we want to make it brighter or darker. Let's look at the reference just real quick. You know, that's how it looks in the render. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is, for the little balls on top of the spikes, I'm going to make it kind of like a brass color. So just really quickly, once again, we're going to take this, we're going to say new standard material, double click it. Okay, this time for the color, we're going to choose kind of like a I don't know, 30 degrees on the hue, and choose sort of like this color, like that. And then guess what we're going to do? Let's slide our metalness all the way up, and our roughness to about 0.45. And then boom, we've got a nice burnished brass look. And I'm not going to, and I'm going to call it brass. And I'm not going to bother, like, you know, putting any scratches or roughness on it or anything like that. Just put it on the sphere. And now we've got like a little brass thing so nobody cuts their fingers on these sharp spikes. A similar thing is going to be going on for the gold. So I'm going to quickly just go ahead and say new standard material. Let's call it gold. Double click it. Find a gold color. It's going to be more towards the yellow side. So we'll make the hue more around 45 degrees. Okay. And we'll make the color sort of more around here. Okay. Something like that. And slide that metalness all the way up. And slide the roughness to about 0.45. Okay, that's going to be more of a gold than before. Give it a little bit more saturation there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to drag that onto the letters. And you can see that there's a, it's nice, but it's too, how should I say, smooth, okay? So if you look at the reference, we had more of a hammered gold that had a texture in it, which was nice. So what we're going to do is, once again, we're going to double click on the texture. We're going to go ahead plus, we're going to say, Maxon noise again. I'm going to use, I really like this displaced Voronoi for this type of thing. So we're going to use displaced Voronoi. We're going to go over, we're going to make a bump map. Like that. We're going to drag that over to here. Input, output to here. Okay, it's way too much. It's a little bit too much, so we'll drag the height down to about 0.5. It's a height field, by the way. It's grayscale, so we'll drag that up. You might even want to make it a little bit less, to around 0.33. So there we have it. Now that that gold is there, okay, we want to do a similar thing for the crown. So we're just going to drag it right onto the crown. Okay, so then that's also going to get the same thing. Okay, so we're making good progress on our texturing job. Now, for this little thing, what I want to do, and I'm not sure that I did it in this render. Not really. Here it actually looks like a plastic button, okay? But I don't want it to look plastic. Afterwards, I decided actually that really should be like a glass button, you know, like if it's crystal or glass or something like that would be nicer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, actually now's the time, just in case, to save your work might be a good idea. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new standard material, always standard material, and we're going to go over here, and on here I'm going to make it sort of like a red color, like a deep red color, something like right there, boom. Okay, and we'll leave the reflection where it is. Okay, and now if I were just to take this red color, I'm going to just call it bead or something. Red bead. And if I were to drag that right on top of what it's actually called dot here, like that. If I were to drag it right there. So right now that's in the, it still looks like the plastic. Okay. If I want, I can maybe like a little bit less saturated. Something around there. Or it was nice saturated. So the question is that how to make this look more like glass and less like a plastic dot. Okay? And the way to do that is by clicking on the standard material. This is one of the powers of the standard material. And you simply, what you do is you up the transmission. So if we up the transmission, watch what happens. First of all, it becomes colored glass. It becomes like glass. And the thing is that we don't really want it to be glass, like, you know, like a wine glass or something like that. Because when you up the transmission, it ignores the diffuse color. You might as well throw it away. You have to put the color here. So let's choose the little eyedropper and click on this color here. And now it's looking like glass. Okay? And that's the way you would do it. So the thing is that that time really that we spent setting this color, it's for nothing. It's only if you want it to look like red plastic or a diffuse material do you put it up here. If you want it to be like a red glass, you have to put that color here and up the transmission weight to 1. Okay? And that's how you can get like a glass bead. Now, so what I want to do now is I want to texture this box. Okay? So we're going to make a new texture. Okay? So should I use a material or a standard material? That's right. I'm sure that everybody raised their hand and said standard material. So what we're going to do is double click that. And we're going to press plus and add a little texture node. And we're going to go ahead into the attributes and pick up a texture called boxwood. And then what we're going to do is we're going to drag that into the color. And before I deal with the other stuff, you know, the bump or anything like that, let's actually drag this, let's call it boxwood here. Okay, because you do want to name your materials. You don't want every material to be RS standard, RS standard, RS standard. Then you won't really know what's going on. Okay. Anyway, we're going to bring this over to the unscripted box. And that looks okay, but you'll notice something funny is going on with the textures. So you see something odd is going on with the textures. You know, it doesn't look right. It's all screwed up. Okay. And that is because it's doing that. The UVs aren't really set up correctly. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the texture tab. Okay. And we are going to change the UV mapping not to flat like we did for the unscripted. We did for this section over here. Not that. We're going to choose what's called cubic. Cubic. And already you'll see that it's better. Okay? And if you look at it with this texture tool, you can see how it's being mapped. It's being mapped, it's kind of like flat. It's being mapped flat, but instead of only from one direction, it's mapping flat this way, flat this way, flat from the top, flat from the back, flat from the right, flat from the bottom. And it's just putting this, texture in there in a nice way. And that's what we want. Okay, so that's good. If you want, you know, if for whatever reason you want to scale this down or move it around or whatever, you can do that. You can see how you're changing the texture on the sides and on the front this way. And then, you know, however you want to do it. I'll just leave it, you know, default mapping like that. So that's good. Let's see. Looks like my Redshift window is not 100% anymore. It's at 150. So I'll make it back to 100%. So let's see now about some of the other features of this boxwood. Let's go ahead and copy and paste that texture and see what else we've got in there for the boxwood. We've got the bump map. So let's bring the bump. Okay, let's bring in the bump node. And let's bring this into their input, output. Okay, it's a height field. And let's see how much bump we're actually, oops, that is not where I wanted to zoom in. I want to zoom in here. You can see that actually the bump is very strong right now. So a lot of the reflection is actually disappearing. So I just want to bring it way down to like, let me give it just a little bump. So like 0.25. And then this way we still get some of the reflection in there, but yet there's still a bump as well. Here it is at 0. Becomes even more reflective, but we're going to put a little bump on it. Here it is at 1. You can see that like it kind of kills the reflection. So we'll make it at 0.25. That's fine. And then there's another one here, which is the reflection map, which we don't really need to put in here actually, because this kind of has a uniform reflection, but since we have it, we'll put it in there. But you could leave it off on yours if you prefer the way that it looks without it. And you could just have an all-over reflection slider. You know, a lot of times when you get these materials, well, that's the bump map. I need a texture mode node. Oh, I don't need a bump map. I need just a texture. So let me take this, copy and paste it, and bring in the reflection and bring that into the reflection node. Okay. It's really not that reflective. So if you want, you could ramp it to make it more reflective. You know what? I think that I just liked it with like a kind of a little bit of a reflection, just dial it in on myself. I think that I'm just going to put it in at around 0.33. And then I've got my own sort of reflection in there, and it'll be fine. It's almost, because I mean, it's not a scratchy surface. No, you know, it's fine. Okay. So now let's just talk about this shelf right here. Okay. So by now this should be coming old hat to you. New standard material. We'll call it shelf. We'll double click it. Okay, we'll make a new texture node. We'll drag in this shelf. We'll also make we'll make another texture. We'll drag that. We'll drag in the shelf bump. Okay, if I have a bump, I know I'm gonna need a bump node. Okay, put that in there. Put this into the bump map. Okay, actually this would be interesting because we can actually take a look at this. Actually, let's bring this onto the shelf. Okay, so right now we didn't put the wood texture on there yet, but you can see the bump is working. See that? You can already see that there's a bump, but it's like really, really high. So we want to go ahead and we want to go in here. I mean, it's gnarly, you know what I'm saying? We're going to lower this to, like, let's say 0.25. Okay, so it's a little bit better. Okay, or you could even say 0.2. So now we have a little bump. Okay, so you can see how that's how bump maps work. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll bring in the color here to there. We'll up it the matteness of the reflection a little bit. So to, let's say, so it's not quite as shiny. Actually, I like it shiny, so I'm just gonna make it a little bit more matte. Okay, and then what's happening is that what I want is that I don't really like the way that this first of all, this texture, I want to change it again. I want to change, if I click on the texture tab, I want to change the UV mapping to cubic. Okay, so there it is, cubic. Okay, but I don't really like the way that that's being mapped. What I want to do is I want to rotate it. Although maybe I do like it, but let's rotate it anyway for the sake of science. So I still have this texture tool, so what I'm going to do is choose this rotation tool. First I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees this way. That's actually how I want it. Okay, so that way the grain is going this way and not this way. But that's just a question of personal choice of what you want to do. Okay, now we only have one more texture to do, and it's an important one, and it's the brick wall. But before I do that, actually, I was just thinking, why don't I try to add a little bit of metalness to this greenish texture here. Okay, because it's like called copper. So let's actually double click it. And let's go ahead to the standard material and let's up the metalness, not all the way because that's going to make it like really shiny. Okay, but let's like add a little bit to it. Like maybe that much. So here it is with none. And here, let's go halfway. Kind of cool, actually. But I don't want it really pronounced, so I'm going to put 0.33. I kind of like it, and I kind of liked it before, too, so let me put 0.125. Okay. So that's good. It's got a little bit of a metal feeling to it now. If you like it better the other way where it had no metal feeling to it, you could just drag that down to 0. And then it's more kind of like painted, flat painted stuff. Anyway, you can fool around with that. Actually, I lied. There's actually 2 more textures we have to do. We've got to do the feet. Okay, so the feet is really going to be really easy. Okay, it's just going to be kind of a rubberish texture. So we're going to say materials, standard. We're going to double click that. We're going to make it darker. Okay, we're going to make it very rough. Okay, we're just going to make it a very rough type of thing, maybe even darker, almost like black rubber. So we'll make it like 4%. So it's just a blackish rubber, and maybe not quite as rough. Okay, actually it's fine. And then we're just going to call that rubber. And we're going to drag that onto the feet. Where is the feet? So they're all in this null here. Like that. Okay. It's a little bit dark actually. Maybe I'll just raise it up just a touch to about 7. And there we have it. Okay. So now comes for something very important. Okay. And that is the brick wall behind this whole thing. Okay. Now, before when we were talking about bump maps, we also had a little discussion about displacement maps. So as we can see, we've been using bump maps to great effect. We created a bumpy texture on the iron. We created a bumpy texture on the gold. On almost everything has a bump or normal map onto it. Okay? But we want to create a displacement map for the bricks because we want them to actually displace the geometry. Okay? So I'm going to create a new standard material. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call it brick. And then I'm going to double click it and make a new texture. And I'm going to go ahead over here to this little folder thing under textures. And I'm going to choose brick wall. Okay. And it brings in a brick texture map that you know, is basically looks something like this. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that onto the color of the Redshift standard material. Okay, and then I'm going to bring that brick texture onto this back wall plane that we made. Okay. Now what it does is that there it is. Okay? But as you can see, oops, there we go again. As you can see, there's no sort of texture on this. Okay? It looks almost like as if we printed it onto like shiny paper, like wallpaper or something. It's not very convincing. Okay? It doesn't really look like a brick textured wall. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a displacement map. And in this case, a displacement map is going to be like a height field. It's going to use grayscale values to tell it. The lighter the color of the pixel, the more out it's going to be from the surface, and the darker the color is, the more, inset that part of the geometry is going to be. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead into the plus. We're going to say texture. We're going to bring in a text. We want to bring in a texture map. Okay. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring in the brick wall displacement.png. Brick wall displacement.png, and this is what it looks like. So we're going to click open, click no, and you're going to see that what happens is it brings it in. Now, the thing is that we, just like before when we had a normal and a bump map, we had to put it in a bump node. Okay, we need to create a displacement node. So let's go ahead, just DS displacement node right there. So we're going to double click that. And we're going to take this and we're going to pipe it out from here into the input, into the text map of the displacement node. And then we're going to take this displacement node, okay, here, and we're going to plug it into the displacement input of the output node. Like that. As soon as we do that, nothing happens. Sorry to let you down there, but there's more stuff that we have to do to get the displacement map working. And it's kind of tricky, actually. I actually think that they're going to make this a little bit more straightforward in the future, but it's kind of tricky what you have to do. The first thing you need to do is on this back wall thing, we need to right click it and give it a RS object, Redshift object tag. So see, we've given it a Redshift object tag. And in this Redshift object tag, under geometry, we want to override its geometry. Because remember, displacement maps create new geometry. They're not like bump maps, which only affect the normals of the surface. Okay? And then what we want to do is after we override the geometry, we want to click on enabled for the tessellation, which is basically going to tell you that we want to tessellate the polygons. And then what we're going to do is we're going to enable the displacement. And still nothing happens. Okay? So this is sort of like where what we can do is we can up the maximum displacement to like 10. Okay? And the displacement scale will also make that 10. Still nothing is happening. Actually, a little something is happening. Okay? You'll notice that there is a little thing going on there. Okay? Because where you really want to control it more is you want to go back to the displacement node. You want to control it here. So let's say we up it to like 2. Okay. Now you notice there's more displacement. Let's up it 3. There's more. Let's actually go all the way up to 6. Okay, and now we're really starting to see kind of like a nice displacement. Although the whole thing looks like it's covered with like a big coat of urethane because it's so shiny. But we're going to fix that later. Okay. So as a matter of fact, why don't we fix that right now? So the thing is that what we're going to do is we're going to say, actually, before we fix that, I do want to show you something. If I go, let's actually up this to 8, just for the point of discussion. Okay. And if I go to this edge here, it looks flat here, right? But if you were to really look at this edge, you'll see that we are actually displacing the geometry of this thing. It's not a flat edge here. You see how ragged this is? Because we're actually displacing the geometry of the surface. Okay? So, now, so having said that, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and we want to choose the reflection, not a texture map again. We want to bring in texture map. Texture. Okay. Bring in under bricks the brick wall reflection, which looks something like that. No. We want to pipe this into the roughness channel. And that's better. Okay, if let's say, for example, I wanted a little bit more reflection on those bricks. Okay, once again, I can go ahead and go over here and make a ramp. And bring this in to the input. Alt input, which is what I find, what I found works. Okay, and we'll now go into the reflection, and in the ramp, okay, let's make it so that way. An easy way to do this is that we're going to make this so that we're going to lower the brightness of it, like that. And that would have the effect of giving it a little bit more reflection. See that? It's more reflective. Now, looks like that's it. Looks like we've actually come to the end of our Redshift texturing section of this episode, part 2 of CG Unscripted, Cinema 4D, and Redshift. To summarize, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about using the standard material instead of the RS material, which is the RS standard instead of RS material. That's useful. We've talked about how to create bump maps, what the difference between bump maps and normal maps are, how to use flat projection or cubic projection to get different looks, difference between displacement maps and bump and normal maps, how to create metallic textures, how to create a glass type of look, as in this bead over here. how to create, like how to use Maxon noise to create a hammered or you know, or a bumpy look. It doesn't have to just be a map. It can be a noise. And how to use HDRIs to, you know, HDRs to, or image-based lighting to light your scene with an image-based lighting, high dynamic range image. So, hopefully that gets you started with a pretty solid footing into starting to really get into texturing with Redshift. As I said, you know, you can feel free to download the practice files here on Gumroad. I'll link it the description, the link. I'll put the link in the description so you can have that, and you could download it for free if you want, or you can leave a little donation if you want to help out. So, having said that, thank you so much for coming and watching this episode, this first episode, second part, first episode of CG Unscripted. If you have any ideas for future shows or things that you'd like to see, let me know. I'll be happy to entertain those and do my best to do that for you. If you have anything you want to contribute to the broadcast in terms of ideas or anything like that, let me know. And besides that, thanks a lot. And hopefully you got something out of it, and see you next time. Take care now.